Hello, everybody, and welcome to the presentation on Taproom by the Numbers. Nancy and I are very excited to talk numbers with you. We love numbers, we love data, key metrics, and the like. So as we kind of go through the material here, if there's any questions, we would love to have them from you. Just pop them in the chat. We'll put our contact information up as well in the next slide or so. So if you would like to set up a call or to email us directly with any questions, we're happy to take them that way as well. So if there's something that doesn't lend itself to a question in the chat, happy to do a phone call. And then we'll have recordings of this presentation available for you as well at the conclusion. So this is me. My name is Kary Shumway. I'm a CPA, CFO, numbers guy. I do love the numbers. Partner and CFO for Wormtown Brewery in Worcester, Massachusetts. And I spent 15 years as a CFO for a beer distributor in the Northeast. And we sold all sorts of products from big domestic beer to craft beer to wine to snacks and so forth. So really familiar with the distribution side of the beer business as well. And I have founded Craft Brewery Financial Training, which is an online resource for breweries. We have on-demand courses, lots and lots of resources. So feel free to check those out at craftbreweryfinancialtraining.com. And a lot of the materials we'll cover today, or at least the spreadsheets that we'll be running through, are available there for free. So you can go check that out. So my purpose in creating and helping to create this presentation and creating Craft Brewery Financial Training, really share what I've learned, shorten the learning curve for you so that you can create a financially successful brewery. So that's me. Now let's hear about you, Nancy.
Awesome. I'm Nancy Trigg. I'm the Chief People Officer at Arryved. And what that means for me is that I'm responsible for, stewarding the relationships both within our company and with our industry partners outside of our company. I work directly with hundreds of taprooms, GMs, owners, and the things that I know and that I'm going to be sharing today are actually things I've learned from people like you all, just by being very involved in their businesses. My purpose today is sharing knowledge in a way that keeps the industry strong, helping everyone to grow and thrive. This industry is very dear to me, and I feel like the more that we can all continue to share information and learnings with each other, the more this industry can continue to grow. All right, things that we're going to talk about today. Kary and I are going to be volleying a little bit back and forth, sharing insights from our perspective. But we're going to talk about key metrics that drive the taproom profitability. We're going to talk about how taproom and taproom information can actually influence your production schedules, how to use that data, and also how to forecast your production schedules and make barrelage decisions. We'll be talking about taproom data that drives beverage offering and how to use that information. And then just wrapping up with increasing profits in all areas of your business, using data, of course, because we both like data. All right, let's jump in. Key metrics that drive taproom profitability. I'm going to start off with a little humor of my own. It's the journey. See, that's capitalized, y'all. The journey, not the destination. I want to say that because what happens whenever I talk or we talk is we get a lot of questions afterwards. Things like, you all said a 20% labor to sales average was ideal. I'm not doing that. Am I doing something wrong? And what I don't want to do is create a sense for anyone that they're doing things wrong. What we want to talk about is how to focus on the data, what data to focus on. And the goal should always just be doing a little bit better. So don't get hung up on any of the numbers. We will throw some numbers out today, but it's not about that. It's about just understanding where your business sits and how to continually improve. So one metric that I think is really important and critical to look at in your tap room is the labor versus sales percentage. Just so that you know if you're staffing properly, right? Those numbers could range anywhere between like 15 to 35%, depending on your service model. They could be higher, they could be lower, depending on how you're operating. But it's a number that you want to keep an eye on and be looking at regularly and making sure it's not going way up. Or if it is going way down, is your service declining? So you just want to keep watching those numbers and seeing how they're doing. Average tab size is a number that I think is actually one of the most influential, right? If you can get each tab size up by $1 or 50 cents even over the course of a month and all the visitors you have, if you continue to see that average go up, that's really what's going to impact your bottom line the most. So it's a good number to watch to see trends and to know if the things you're doing are right. So order times is another big one. If you don't have order times, not every system can provide that. Revenue per hour and then back that out for the average length of guest. But this is going to give you insight into when your busiest times are, what things sell at different times of day, things like that. So that then you can either staff appropriately or manage your costs appropriately based on that information. So, and if you're doing, takeout food that needs to be warmed up, something that you're heating up, if you're not selling it until 1:00, don't start heating it up at noon or you're going to have more waste. So it's just looking at those times and understanding how that impacts your business. And then also understanding your profit by category, and making sure that whatever is your most profitable category of your business, that you're actually really promoting that and upselling that to all of your guests. So just some key points to look at.
Those are great ones. I love those. When we're talking about key metrics, there's lots of best practices to keep in mind, but I think one of them is really to measure stuff that's going to make a difference, something that's material. And I think we could probably all agree that the payroll side of the expenses is a pretty material item. So I particularly like the labor to sales percentage and kind of monitoring that. So I want to take you guys through is looking at key metrics really from the standpoint of financial forecasting. So two of the most important, there's lots of metrics, lots of things we can measure, but two of the most important at their most basic are sales and margins. So I want to talk about how to create a taproom sales forecast, what those key metrics are. And generally, when we're looking at forecasting through the taproom from a sales perspective, we can look at a number of different data points, but really we want to look at what we would call rate times volume. So rate is what people are going to spend. Volume is how many people are going to come in. You do the multiplication, and you have a pretty good top level look at that. So I want to take you through some models that I use to build up these sales by category. Really the key, Nancy had mentioned the trends. I think that's super important, not just to kind of measure where are we at and where do we want to be, but kind of where have we come from? What does the trajectory look like? I like it. There's a saying that says the trend is your friend. And it is kind of true. So if you have historical data and you can kind of look back, and see what your month-over-month sales have looked like relative to say growth, things of that nature, in volume, that can kind of help inform these metrics that we want to create. So we can also use this forecast to inform our production plan. So it's interesting when I'm working with newer or startup breweries, there's a tendency to create financial projections that we're going to sell X and then we're going to sell 2X and then we're going to sell 3X year over year over year, but we don't really take into consideration always the capacity or our ability to actually produce that much beer. So as we're creating a forecast, we want to just do the sniff test to make sure, okay, can we actually produce sufficient beer to hit these sales numbers? So this is a very simple model. Again, if anyone's interested in getting these, you can either email me, Kary at beerbusinessfinance.com is the easiest way, or just you can get this at craftbreweryfinancialtraining.com as well. So first step, key metrics is to have a sales forecast. Most folks don't. Most times we're just kind of looking month to month, seeing how we're doing. Looking at cash in the bank and so forth. But the process of creating a sales forecast doesn't have to be any more complicated than this. Nancy had mentioned looking at your profitability by category. So I recommend starting your sales forecast by category as well. Keep it relatively simple. So down the left-hand side of this sales forecast model, we would just want to list out the different types of things that you're selling. So if you have food, obviously you've got draft beer, retail, growlers, and so forth. Whatever you're selling, just list those major categories. And then across the top, we want to try to project out what we anticipate for sales in each of these categories. And the goal here is really the key metric that we're looking at is what do we anticipate for sales for the balance or the remainder of this year, and then forward forecasting for next year so that we have something to track against. What do we expect is going to happen? We can track against it and see what actually happened and do some variance analysis on where we might be missing the mark. So we list our categories across the top in the first column. We want to list out, try to get like a full year, or in some cases we can do trailing 12 months of sales on each of these categories. We just want to set the context of, where is the revenue coming from? What does that look like by category? If we don't have a full year, we can look at the balance of the current year. So we want to say, we're recording this here in October, so we may get 9 months of full sales activity for these categories. And then the third column over, I want to project out the remainder of the year. So when it's October, November, and December, what do we anticipate having for sales? And that's going to give us sort of a projected full year for our current year, in this case, 2022. Now we want to project out next year. So we want to look at some growth. So if we've got historical growth, so for example, 2022 versus 2021, what are the percentage growth that we're seeing in each of these categories? We can plug those in. We can make some adjustments based on what we anticipate happening. And that's going to help us project out the volume for the subsequent year. So pretty straightforward. The more data that we have, a little bit easier it is to kind of get our hands around this. But I think it's a good first step as far as creating a simple forecast. We can always get more detailed with these numbers as we go. So once we have a sales forecast, we got a pretty good handle on our categories, what we anticipate for sales for this year, what that looks like growth-wise, and then forward forecast to 2023. We can take that same information and project out our gross margins. So I would argue that the gross margins are one of the most, if not the most important number in your financials, and probably one of the most important key metrics. We'll talk a lot about a lot of different ones, but gross margin super important. So here what we want to do is do a little bit of research and analysis and determine what have we seen historically for our gross margins for each of these categories. And we can drop those percentages in. Let's just say food, for example. Food's 50% gross profit. Your taproom draft beer, say, is 80%. Retail beer maybe is 60%, and so forth. Results are going to vary, but the concept is you want to go in and calculate it. What did we actually make on the food category, say year to date? And let's plug that gross margin in. If we're going to make any changes to the menu that might affect our gross margin, we want to factor that in as well. Then we're going to multiply those percentages by our projected volume, and that's going to give us projected margin dollars. So if you fill out these two spreadsheets, we've got a quick and dirty sales forecast, we got a quick and dirty gross margin forecast, and we've got two key metrics that can really help inform, how we drive business through the taproom. So sales growth, margin percentage, and then ultimately how that's going to help us, monitoring these key metrics.
Awesome. We're going to jump into a little bit of forecasting on the production side now. So how do you forecast and how do you use that taproom data to forecast? I'm just going to start with a few key items and then let Kary again go into more detail. But one place to start when you're forecasting the production needs of your taproom is by looking at, obviously, historic sales. So how many ounces of product did we move through the taproom last month, last quarter, last year, and really understand that. Again, break it down by type. How many ounces of each product did we sell? And then start making your estimates from there. If you're not already, another good item to track is how long each keg or each type of beer lasts in your taproom. That'll help you make production decisions that don't have you running out of certain beers at the end of the month and having extras of others. Some systems will help you track this, others do not. And if you don't, simply keeping a spreadsheet of the date you put a keg on and the date you took it off is going to help you understand that better long term. But it's important to also look back seasonally, because just because you sold, a whole lot of lagers last month, it's now October. You might not have sold that many lagers last year in October. You might have sold more Oktoberfest. So it's good to really understand what sold when and take not just last month's sales in, but same time last year and look at those trends. Another thing to really look out for is what Kary and I are making up a term collision indicators, looking for those things that tend to impact other items that you sell. And I want to give an example here that my friends over at Denver Beer Company shared with me that I think is a really good, gives you sort of ideas of how to think of collision. So they were looking regularly at the different types of beers that we're selling. So, if we sell an IPA, if we put an IPA on, does that impact, other beer types? And they were looking at individual items and couldn't find any trends in those individual items. So looking at individual brands, there were no trends. So instead, they started looking at the types of beer. So IPAs versus lagers, etc. And what they found in those trends is it didn't matter if they had 2 IPAs or 4 IPAs. 30 to 35% of their sales was going to be IPAs, right? And when you have information like that, you can start making smarter decisions around what beers to put on at the same time and how those beer sales might impact other things. So just a really good example of how to sort of creatively look at that data rather than just looking at the obvious line items.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We had talked offline about the different terms. I like the collision indicators, things colliding into each other. In distribution, they tend to call it cannibalization. So, for example, if let's just say you're selling a 4-pack 16 ounce of one of your brands, and then you want to roll out a 12-pack, well, how much is that 12-pack going to eat into your 4-packs? And then looking at those, how those sales are going to collide. So within your taproom and obviously out at retail, it's a very real thing. So as Nancy pointed out, having the data and looking at that can be super important to make those decisions. So we'll take a little bit of a side turn here. We've been talking primarily about the taproom and the activity that occurs there. But if you're looking to bring your beer outside of your taproom and go out into the market, it becomes super important to really monitor your kegs. One of the biggest problems that self-distributing breweries and even wholesalers have is really maintaining a good inventory of your kegs. The kegs live in your warehouse, they live out at retail, and they're in transit and so forth. So really kind of keeping a close eye, having a good system to understand what's out there is super important. So inventory counts to ensure accurate numbers are critical. And then as you're making the economic analysis of, well, it's a common question, do I buy these kegs? Do I lease them? Do I handle them in some other way? We really just kind of want to sketch out what does it look like in terms of the different metrics on that? What do the financials look behind that? So if we were to buy a keg, how long is that going to last? What kind of maintenance how am I going to track it? If there's any critical factor here, it's that if you have a good system to track and monitor your kegs, financially, you're almost always going to make out better if you can purchase your own kegs. If that's going to be difficult, because administratively, you need to keep track of these. You likely will need a really tight handle on what kegs are going out, where they're residing, how long they're staying out there at retail, when they're coming back, if they're coming back. And absent a system like that, you may want to look at doing more of a lease model, whereby the responsibility for the tracking is a little bit, it's not on you so much. So you don't have to worry about that quite as much. So what we want to do as we're looking at our barrelage decisions is first, do we want to lease? Do we want to buy? What kind of systems do we have to track our inventory? How do we want to forecast the number of kegs? We need to take our sales model and kind of look at what do we anticipate selling? What's going to be kegs? What's going to be packaged beer? And what does that look like in terms of how many kegs we already have on hand? What we might need to purchase in order to keep up with any expected growth or future demand. So that sales forecast can really not only inform what we think we're going to do from a production standpoint, but all the different things that we're going to need to meet that production. In other words, our barrels. So really looking at those components. What do we have? What's our sales forecast? What's the turn that's out there? And how quickly they're going to come back. So as we sort of stay outside the taproom now and we think about what are the other considerations as we're selling beer outside of the taproom, one of the biggest is when we're selling beer through our taproom, it's entirely within our control. So we can look and see, all right, do we have fresh beer? We do. Once it goes outside of our tap room, goes to on-premise locations and off-premise locations, we lose visibility and control. So being mindful of shelf life, close coded beer, out of code product is a real big issue. We talk about this close code or out of code is a real problem for everybody, because the consumer doesn't want beer that's old, and certainly it's a poor reflection on your brewery. So having good systems to check what's out there, obviously sending fresh beer to the market, but double checking that proper rotations are happening and so forth. So whether you're self-distributing or using a wholesaler, we really want to try to use that taproom sales data to inform what might sell outside of your walls. And as Nancy's alluded to, the more you can monitor what's turning within your taproom, you've got a better story to tell when you go out to retail. So whether you're selling it self-distribution directly to a retailer, they're going to want information about, well, why this beer, why not that beer? What information do you have relative to volume that we could expect? What kind of history do we have here? So that taproom data is not only useful for driving your sales internally within your own taproom, it can be very useful once you leave the taproom walls and you go out to retail as well.
All right. Well, Kary alluded to sort of this next topic, which is how to use that information that you're getting in your taproom. From my perspective, I like the visual of the taproom as the showroom, right? This is a place where you're getting your products out there for the first time. And there's so much information available to you as a result of that decision, right? Having that immediate audience right in front of you. Kary made one point I'd like to reiterate, which is using this data to inform when you're selling, right? This is a really popular lunch beer. People tend to buy this beer at lunch. Will then help, your retail locations or your on-premise locations to know when to promote this product. So gathering this data, sharing this data, and making it useful to anyone who's selling your product is really important. Also, you have an opportunity to learn things like, what size pours do folks usually want this product in? Not always defaulting to pints is a really good idea, like trying out half pours and 12 ounces and tasters and things like that so that you can see what's moving. It also really, there's details, or there's information in the data, details about your product that could inform what you're making. The obvious one is if something's selling in single ounce pours and not selling in pints, that's information, right? That's information you need, that people who are trying this beer are not coming back for it. But there's going to be other products you're selling where people just are constantly going straight to the pint size because you've done your job. You've already marketed it. You've made people excited about this product, and they're just going to come in and go for it. So it gives you information about what you're doing well and what needs a little more love. I also think using the people in your tap room more is really important. You've got a lot of folks on the floor interacting with staff on a regular basis. I think it's a really good idea to get those folks talking to your production team, right? Whether it's once a month, you all sit around over beers and share feedback. That feedback is a lot more valuable than what you see on Yelp, right? Like getting that real insider insight right away. And another way to do this is to actually build into your system comp notes. So when things happen, like people don't like a product, have your staff ask the guest, what did you not like about it? And then let the guest see them entering that information. That's going to get the information that you want back to your team rather than having it posted publicly. So creating that feedback loop and helping people to see the best way to get that information back to your staff is really important. It's also, I mentioned this earlier, I think I might have put it on 2 slides, but understanding how long different kegs last in your tap room is super important. It's going to give you information about how quickly things are going to move of a particular brand. So understanding that time, but also knowing how much you can actually sell out of a barrel. Kary's going to go into some prediction numbers in a minute, but one of the things that will really help you get to the heart of what's selling is to do things like track the comps So anytime you spill something, anytime an employee drinks something, whatever is happening to that product, the more granular you can get on where every ounce of that product is going, the more information you're going to really have about how much you're selling per keg. It's going to help you forecast better. It's going to help you predict your revenue better. Loss is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Giving beers to your staff is not a bad thing. Comping to friends on the street, not a bad thing. But understanding exactly how much of that you're doing and what your true revenue and profit per barrel is going to help your forecasting and planning be much more accurate and useful.
So Nancy, one of Nancy's points was talking about the different sizes of your offerings. And one spreadsheet that I have that might be interesting is to do some calculations on how you're currently monetizing your beer right now. So this will have a couple of different uses for you. One would be just in the financial sales forecasting. This can kind of give you a sense as to what you tend to get as a revenue per barrel. So it's a very common question. What should I see? What should my sales per barrel be? And the usual answer is, well, it depends, but typically you'll see it somewhere between $800 and $1,200 a barrel, and results will vary. So for simplicity, we usually say, figure $1,000 a barrel, give or take. So that's a barrel beer, 31 gallons, not a keg, but putting the two together. So some ways that you can kind of play with that. Number one would be tracking that for yourself, just kind of looking historically, month over month. How many barrels did we push through the tap room? What was our revenue? Do the math, make sure it's all beer. And at least you have some trends to look at. To get more granular with it, you could use a calculator like this, where we're really just taking the total number of ounces of beer that we've got in a barrel and trying to figure out different assumptions. Like, for example, the total ounces doesn't change. It's 128 ounces a gallon times 31 gallons. We have just under 4,000 ounces to deal with here. We're going to have beer loss, right? You can call it loss, call it comp beer, what have you. We're going to have foamy kegs. We're going to have employee beer. We're going to have basically beer that we don't monetize. So in this example, and we can plug in different numbers, let's just say of 4,000 ounces we have available to sell through that barrel, maybe we sell right around 3,000. Now the next slide will show how do we want to kind of allocate those ounces. So here at the top, we're just left with our total beer available, about 3,000 ounces. And then we can kind of list out the different offerings that we have. So draft beer in 16 ounce, 12 ounce, 10 ounce, the 3 ounce flights, growlers, any combination, what you might have. So we're just simply listing out what could we sell, what's the size of each of these, and how many units have we sold or would we anticipate selling, and then what does that look like in terms of how we would monetize this particular barrel. So you can play with these, drop in different calculations. In this example, we're just estimating we're going to have 90 16-ounce drafts and 20 12-ounce drafts and so forth, and we're popping in our price per unit. So if we've got $6 for a 16-ounce draft, $6 for a 12-ounce draft, you can put in your actual price there and then see what this looks like in terms of monetizing that barrel. So if you do all the math on this one, it turns out to about $1,100 per barrel. Now, to Nancy's point, if you get in there and you look at this and you're like, well, we're selling a crap ton of, say, 10 ounces, we can get a little bit more for this. Maybe it's just the given style or whatnot, or people just like that size. We can play with the numbers and see what that looks like in terms of monetizing that barrel. Obviously, less ounces, a higher ring rate, we're going to get a higher dollar per barrel in terms of monetizing it. So it's just a way to kind of get a little granular, play with the numbers a little bit. So the two takeaways, again, looking at your historical sales per barrel, seeing what that's looked like trend-wise over the last 12 to 24 months, I think is a nice time frame. And then kind of playing with your options in terms of what you can sell, what you're charging for it, and how you might be able to not only you're going to monetize that barrel, but how you might be able to improve that sales per barrel calculation.
Awesome. So we've been getting pretty specific, and now we're going to go a little more broad and just talk about general ways to increase profits all across your business. Again, using data because we like data. But let's start here. Those of you who've been hanging out on Craft Beer Professionals for a while, this is going to sound redundant, but I don't think we can say it enough, so I'm going to say it again. The number one way to increase profit in all areas of your business is to ask for the sale, right? So if you are selling to-go items, train your staff to tell the guests as they're leaving or as they're about to pay, would you like to add a 6-pack or would you like to add a bottle onto this order? Same thing with your merch, right? Would you like a hat with that? Great way to keep your sales up. If you're not doing this, you are missing out on revenue opportunities. So I don't mind the redundancy. I'm going to say it again. Second one is doing things like bundling. So bundling your items. If you buy a hat, you get a beer at half price. If there's certain items that you're trying to move, make sure that you're figuring out ways to move those items. If there's things that aren't selling, pair them with something that is and get those items moving. Another thing to do is to segment your reporting by category, and even better, segment it by category by staff member, right? So you might have a particular staff member who is really, really good at moving merchandise. Find out why. Find out what they're doing. Maybe they're wearing a merch item to work every day. Maybe that's what's making the difference. Maybe they're complimenting the guests. Who knows what it is that's getting that to work, but learn that from them, find out, and then replicate that. Train the rest of your staff on those same tools. It's really going to help across the board. I also want to talk about how to look at data creatively. And the best way I've found to do this is to give a really good example. This is an example from our friends at Noda Brewing. And bear with me while I talk about the data for a second, but they were looking at their average spend per guest. And they noticed that on nights when they had bands, that average spend per guest went up, right? People were sticking around longer, enjoying the music, whatever. But they also they had the bands on a night that was less busy. So on a Friday night, they were having bands, they were getting the cost up, the spend up per guest, but it was less guests. So then they looked at Saturday night and they decided for 1 week to just move that band to Saturday night instead of Friday. And what they found was it was a busier night, but they still were able to get that spend up per guest by moving it to a busier night. So it made sense to move their bands to Saturday. So look for those little secrets, right? Look for those little indications within your data. Use the data to test your assumptions. Try something new out. Look at the data and see if it worked. I feel like, in business, we should all be looking at our business every day and kind of thinking about, experimenting a little bit. You're not going to mix things up on a daily basis, but on a monthly basis, having one experiment a month where you're chasing data and seeing what happens can really increase your bottom line across the board.
Yeah, I think that experimentation is super important, because the other thing is it might work one time and it might not work the next. So you want to test it. Did it work? Test it. It didn't work. Try something different. And then just to reiterate what Nancy was saying a minute ago on asking for the sale, and that's in all areas of your business, right? It's pretty clear. I mean, anecdotally, I go to a lot of tap rooms and it's hard for me to remember a time when people have said, oh, do you want, I noticed you were drinking, the Pilsner, do you want some to-go beer? It just doesn't happen. And the stats really bear that out. You ask, my dad used to say, if you don't ask, you don't get. And it's pretty straightforward. So I think if there's that one takeaway, it would be that is you got to ask for the sale in person. And if you're doing e-commerce, look on your website as well. That's another thing too. You go to, or you're planning the weekend and you're looking on the website of some tap rooms you want to visit. And you're like, how would I even, what's under, I don't even know what they're serving, or I wouldn't know how to buy it. So make it really painfully obvious how to buy your beer, and make it painfully obvious for folks that come into your tap room that you have to-go beer or merchandise or something for them to take home as well.
And Kary, sorry to interrupt, but just one thing I meant to add before too is that it doesn't have to be a different item either. So if they come in and they try a stout, they might just have that one beer. But if you walk up and say, hey, we just tapped this other stout, would you like to try that too? Now you're just upselling the same product, but getting those tap sizes up.
Yep, absolutely. And I think it's human nature. We don't want to be pushy. We don't want to be salesy. No, most people don't want to be that way. But people are in your tap room because they love your beer. You got to let them know it's there. They're not going to buy it if they don't know. So other ways of thinking about increasing profit in all areas of your taproom business is to do that full taproom financial forecast. So I talked earlier about the sales and margin plan. Those are certainly important. Those are our traditional starting points for creating our financial forecast. But we also obviously want to look at all the expenses that go into running our business. So we call those operating expenses or OPEX. So really listing those out. And then doubling back on margins, we also want to look at the ranges of expected margins within the taproom self-distribution and wholesale. That tends to be a very commonly asked question, like what should I expect if I'm self-distributing my beer? What should I expect if I'm going to go outside of my taproom and use a wholesale? So I will share those numbers with you, again, with the caveat that these are ranges, results will vary, but this might at least set a little bit of context for you. So as we're looking at creating that financial plan, we typically want to just look at 4 key metrics, 4 critical numbers, and that's your sales growth versus your plan. So we tend to express most of these financial projections in terms of percentage. It's just easier to remember. So on the sales side, we want to know what is our growth percentage versus plan. On the margin side, we want to know what our gross margin percentage is versus our plan. Operating expenses, we're looking at really what did we anticipate by line item versus our plan. So that can be payroll, lease expense, insurance, supplies, cleaning, IT, right on down the line. What did we anticipate? What was in our forecast and what's actually occurring and what kind of variances are we seeing? And then the almighty bottom line. And many businesses will start here, which is to say, well, if I want to increase profit in all areas, I should define or quantify what that is first. So we look at the net income line and we express this as a percentage of sales. So we might say we need to have 15% net income as a percentage of sales. So we start there and we can work our way back. But if we're looking at 4 key metrics, these are the 4 financial ones that we would want to monitor. So as we dig in just a little bit on the expected margins, again, results will vary. Certainly don't take these as gospel. These are, in my experience, what I've seen, but I've certainly seen deviations from this. I've seen things outside of these ranges, but typically you could expect your taproom somewhere in that 65 to 75% margins. Now, again, margins is sales minus the cost of those sales. So for selling beer at $6 a pint, what does it cost us to actually, the margins are very high on those. If we've got food, the margin's not as good. Merch, maybe the margin. So we got to look at the mix of sales, and that's going to highly influence what our margins are. But generally speaking, taproom 65 to 75. Self-distribution and wholesale, you're typically going to see the same thing. And this is really just about what are we selling the beer to the retailer for, and what is that wholesale entity purchase the beer for, and then the differential. So in this case, a wholesaler is buying the beer. That'll be the cost of their beer. Then they're selling it out at retail, and typically 25 to 35% margins is approximately the range that we'll see there. Now, again, you may see different product mixes. Your market might be different. You might have more or less competition that's going to influence these numbers. But as you're kind of, and I always recommend, and I know Nancy has as well, so historically look at your own performance and try to do better. But look at your own performance to try to inform what these margin expectations could be. But if you're just starting out, maybe you're just taproom only, you're thinking about going outside your walls, these are some ranges that may be helpful for you to get started. I highly recommend creating a standard set of KPIs. Now, again, KPIs, key performance indicators, critical numbers, key metrics, call them what you will, they all kind of mean the same thing, which is let's measure something that's meaningful, that's going to have a material impact on the financial or operational results of our business, provided that we hit it. So I'm biased, so I tend to really focus on a standard set of KPIs, including your financial KPIs, sales, margins, operating expenses, and net income. So this is just an example of a very quick scorecard that you could create, and it's a summarized version using your financial plan. So sales, our KPIs, we want 10% growth, YOY, that's year over year. So we're looking to grow 10% over last year. Margins, we want 45% blended margins. So in this case, maybe we sell through the tap room, but we're also doing some self-distribution. So our tap room margins and our self-distribution margins are blending to that 45%. Operating expenses, we want to keep that at 30% of sales, and net income, we want 15% net income as a percentage of sales to the bottom line. And again, you can work backwards from that. If it's 15% bottom line, you look at what your margins are, and you can kind of squeeze that operating expense. But really, we're looking at those four numbers: sales growth, margin percentage, operating expenses, and your net income. And if you're watching those, you're in pretty good shape strictly from a financial perspective, keeping track of these numbers.
Awesome. Well, that wraps up the bulk of our content for today. Just want to give a few wrap-ups, few key points from each slide. The first one, I think we've both said this a couple times, Kary, is it's not about a fixed number. Any of these goals, even when Kary put up numbers, they're ballparks, they're ideas. The real big point here is to look at where you are, know where you are, and set yourself goals and targets for improving. And that's really the goal there.
Yeah, and then on the forecasting, production schedules, and your barrel decisions, you've got we think about if you're self-distributing and or using a wholesaler, and obviously you have a production brewery, you have 2 or 3 or 4 different distinct businesses. You've got a tap room, which is selling obviously to your customer. You've got a production brewery that's really acting like a manufacturing business. You might have a self-distribution, which is like a logistics business. So we want to focus on that tap room and look at that data to inform what it is that we might sell outside of our walls to retailers. So really understanding, what's going to work on premise. Nancy had mentioned kind of the velocity of sales, how quickly your stuff turns. Super important information to have, particularly as you're sending beer out into the market. You're losing visibility and control over that product rotation. So we want to be really clear, like when we send beer out, we're pretty confident it's going to turn. There's no guarantees, but if we have that data that we know, hey, this barrel turns every 4 to 6 days, every 7 to 10, whatever the number is, we can feel reasonably confident as we're sending that out and using that taproom data to inform our distribution decisions.
And next, I think that the key point here is that it's really important to be sharing data across your organization. Very often, you've got sort of the taproom business and your distribution business, and they act as almost separate entities. That's fine, right? How you structure your organization, will make sense based on how you want to operate. But getting those teams together, whether it's just sharing data from one side of the business to another to help inform decisions, or whether it's just having conversations about what folks are seeing, what trends are, feedback, things like that, is going to keep your business more in tune with its own sort of holistic messaging and understanding of what's working and what isn't.
And then lastly is increasing profits in all areas of the business. So again, a little bit biased, but I do this within the framework of your financial planning. So we look at our sales and margins, operating expenses, and net income. That's my final plug for the financial plan. But really at its most basic level, when we're trying to sell things, we simply have to ask. And we used to joke about this in the wholesaler world. When we were out, we would have our sales team selling to retail, and we would sell on credit. And we would always say, when you go in, we got to try to collect this money. We have to collect those accounts receivable. And we basically just had, kind of a one word or one sentence is, you got to go in and ask for the check, right? If we need to collect money, you got to ask for it. In this case, we want to ask for the sale. So we've got the customer standing in front of us. We've got a visitor to our website. We want to make sure we're clear and obvious, make it easy for people to buy from us. So asking for the sale is one of the best ways you can increase profit in all areas of your business.
Awesome. All right. Any questions, y'all, before we wrap it up? Oh, hey, Jamar. I see you. Anyone else? All right. Well, here is our contact information. If writing in the chat doesn't feel like the right thing right now, but you want to reach out to either of us with questions, there is our contact information.
Yeah, I enjoyed it, Nancy. Thanks so much for presenting with me, and thanks to Andrew and Craft Beer Professionals. It's been a lot of fun. I hope people have some good takeaways from our talk today.
Awesome. Thanks, Kary. Good to see you as always.
Good to see you.